guess it makes me think a lot about like that theme of resilience and like reframing it in a way where like vulnerability is at the center of that, and that is strength. Like to be vulnerable, that is strength. Vulnerability, that is strength. Like to be vulnerable.
Hi there, welcome back to my channel. So today in this video I'll explore the topic of vulnerability and authenticity and how they're both connected but different. How vulnerability doesn't equate authenticity but can in fact be inauthentic in some situations. And probably the biggest person to speak of vulnerability in interesting places out of all is in corporate world is Brene, and I love her work, and she really brings that dimension, how it can help and foster certain connection and energy beyond anything else, and how much it's needed from the leaders. At the same time, I do feel like vulnerability is something that can be easily overlooked if we just practice it for the sake of practicing it. It's easy to do so because we tend to equate vulnerability with being authentic, right? And sometimes if that's something you're working on creating more intimacy and connections, it's oftentimes we see people swing the other way and just focus on being vulnerable out of context. And what does it mean to be vulnerable out of context? So I'll give two examples. Well, both of them happened recently and both kind of show different situations. One of them relates to the idea of vulnerability where you needed to really understand the situation and the context and create boundaries around vulnerability, but at the same time, how can you stay authentic and still have boundaries? And I think that's a very important distinction. Like, you don't have to lie or be dishonest or be inauthentic, but have boundaries and not share certain topics. And I don't think it's only about communication skills in the sense of being able to divert the conversation to a certain way, but it's also just that feeling and understanding that you are very much an active participant of the conversation, whatever the conversation is. If it's with a stranger or a conversation that you feel like you don't have much choice but to participate in, you're still very much that active participant. A lot of time we take that passive stance, and there could be a lot of beliefs underneath them, and I would suggest really exploring them because they're connected to your own personal truths and to your own patterns that might make vulnerability or boundaries, for that matter, difficult. So for me, one of those beliefs was you never know what will happen, and you never know what you can learn from people or who you can connect with. So it's kind of the sharing in the name of sharing, because you never know what might happen. And while I like that idea, and I like the idea of being open and curious, at the same time I honestly feel like we cannot always be that person, and it's important to understand the context and things that you are feeling in the moment. And when I say the context, I mean your own emotional context and also the context that you find yourself in. So an example for me was that I had to go to an appointment before I was traveling to see my family across the world, and the beautician, she asked me about why am I getting the treatment done, like is there something special that is coming up for me in my life. And it's a very, I guess, standard question, but it's also like, travel plans, why not share that? It does feel like a light conversation. But for me, it wasn't a light conversation for a number of reasons. One of the reasons really is that it wasn't a light topic for me because a lot of things were intertwined in there, right? there is also a certain political climate that is happening right now, and it was just, I knew how often the conversation goes in a certain way, and I just didn't want to go into that conversation. I just felt like I didn't want to have that conversation at the moment, and partly it was also because I didn't have the emotional or mental capacity to have that conversation. And that was also the context of my week. I had a very overwhelming week with a lot of social interactions, and I had a lot of things to get done that day, and so I just felt like I didn't have the energy for that conversation, which could be emotional for me in some ways. And also because the person was a stranger, in those situations, you don't always know how they will react, what is going to, can they receive your vulnerability? And that's another thing. What might be vulnerable for you might not be vulnerable or perceived as vulnerable for other people, and so their response might not be at par with your expectations. And understanding what you need in the moment, and whether when you're sharing and being vulnerable with someone, also knowing can they receive it, and knowing whether you will be okay if they won't be able to. I think that's a very important one. What context is valuable to share these things with, because yes, you can say everyone can learn from us and stuff, but I feel like none of that sharing and knowledge should be done at the expense of yourself. And so here's the second example, which contrasts very well with the first one, is me coming back home to see my family, and my dad, he found weight scales in my room, and they were broken, and so he fixed them. And then my mom told me about it. At the moment when she told me that, my initial reaction was like, well, I have no use for that. Like, I don't use them actually anymore. And in that, it's like that response is so typical for us in many situations, because we're just sharing what's the first thing that comes to our mind in a way, and like the first thing that it's true, right? Like, it was the first thing that I thought about, because I was like, oh, like, I don't need it, instead of really understanding the context of what was happening in that moment, like why my mom shared this even information with me. It wasn't about the scales really, or me using them or anything like that. It was just about, sharing how excited my dad was to see me, and how, I guess, that was his way of showing his love in a way, and the energy behind the action is so important, because if I understand that energy, if I understand that context, I can respond with appreciation. And I used to think about how when I receive gifts or things that I have no use for, well, how can I appreciate it, because it's not something I can use. So is that a lie? Because I don't appreciate, it's not like I appreciate the thought, but I don't really use it. You know what I mean? So there's no value in it for me. But really, like, you can appreciate not even the thought, but the energy, because the exchange is never just at the material level of things. It's also the energy that somebody put in it, right? Like the energy he put into fixing it for me. And it's not so much about the actual item and what am I going to use it for, or whether I'm going to use it for. And why I wanted to give this example specifically, because it is a contested object, it is a contested subject. For me, it was a journey of overcoming a lot of body image issues, of being almost like obsessed at some point with weight loss, and coming to such a peace and acceptance of my body. And so I think I could have responded in the way that shares all of that vulnerability, but in that situational context, that vulnerability is also not needed. It's like, imagine somebody does something small for you that is thoughtful, and it's not like they have an expectation of you to even like, use it or do something with it, and then you go on and share your whole life story with them and like an ideology behind it. And that's the thing, like I am very supportive of the topic of body positivity, and I do believe they need to be voiced and spoken out, but I also believe that the context matters, and I feel like in this context it just really, like, something else was needed in this context, and that was appreciation and recognition, acknowledgement of something that somebody did for you and the action they put behind it, versus your perception of what that thing and object means. And ironically, I actually appreciated it even more because later, as I actually came here and I weighted myself and realized that the number doesn't mean anything, it opened a lot of like self-reflection and just also my own recognition of how far I have come with these things, because it's not something I think about day to day, and that just showed me that contrast. And I feel like even that in itself is a gift, right? And again, it's not that I'm gonna go to my dad and explain all of this and share all of this with him. Sometimes, us emphasizing so much something that is true for us, so for instance, that I have no use for these scales, is also comes across the rejection of other person's effort. But we make a point of sharing and being honest and authentic, and we feel maybe even morally good about for doing that. But really, again, it's not really always about us and our story. And I'm reading this book, which I highly recommend. In contrast with Brene Brown, they talk about similar things and them being about the stories that we tell ourselves. And Brene Brown, she really makes that emphasis on getting curious with that story and how a lot of those stories are fiction, and that we really create them for self-protection. And so similarly, the book talks about the same things, about those protective mechanisms, but I feel like it's not even about the fiction stories. Some of those stories are true and authentic, but we get so immersed into them and so immersed into a certain idea of I and what that I means, that sometimes it overtakes and we don't see what is happening in the moment, in the situation, in the room that we are in, and what is needed from us. And never equate vulnerability with authenticity, because vulnerability without boundaries, vulnerability with anyone at any time, is not authentic. It's not authentic to ourselves, because it's not authentic to other people, because authenticity is also not just about the me. Authenticity about not the me as a story in the mind. Authenticity is also about the me that is the emotional context. Authenticity is also about what is happening in the room, in the situation, with the other person. And sometimes we don't know what's happening with the other person too, right? So sometimes, like if it's closer people to us, we can actually inquire about that too. But yeah, looking at the authenticity as it's just me sharing my story and what that mine and me means, is something that is oversimplifying the complexity of humanity and the complexity of social interactions and connection. Thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful, and I'll include some links with resources under the video below.